Hello and welcome to the Unfamiliar Name Podcast. My name's Jesse Harris, and this is my thing. I just wanted to tell you a couple things about myself as we get started on this inaugural episode of the new and rebranded Unfamiliar Name Podcast. First of all, I am a deacon in the Charismatic Episcopal Church. I am a husband to a wonderful wife, Haley, and then we have three beautiful children, Rowan, Ruby, and Reese. Rowan is 3 years old. He'll turn 4 in November. Ruby is almost 2, and Reese is 7 months old. So it is a party at our house. It's actually legitimately so fun. I love it. It's so hard, but it's so fun and rewarding. Unbelievably rewarding to be a father. And so that's where I'm at in my life. I also currently have a day job as a truck driver for a construction company. And so between those things, balancing those things, thought, you know what I could do? I could take seminary courses since I'm currently in seminary, and I could start a podcast and just kind of see how many layers we could build on top of this full life. So that maybe is the question that I want to answer real quick. Why make a podcast? Not necessarily talking about in the midst of busyness, why would I look for another thing? But why am I so committed to making a podcast that I will find and make the time to do so? I've been working on this for a little while, this whole setup, the technology, and the ideas. And mainly, I think that this comes from, well, first of all, I guess it comes from the fact that I'm a fan of podcasts. I love listening to podcasts. As I'm a truck driver, I always have audio going, and I'm also listening to audiobooks and other things. But there's something important happening right now in the world that I want to be a part of, and that is this information revolution that started with the internet, but now has expanded and become more than just the fact that we're connected on the internet. Now we have these actual new mediums that are becoming globally accessible in a way that nothing else has ever been, and that would be YouTube and podcast, or any other video platform, of course. What's happening right now is that there are ways of getting the spoken word out there that are so ubiquitous that more people in the world today have access to podcasts than ever have had access to the printed word or have ever had access to traveling spokespersons or storytellers. And so there's something happening today where more people have access to information than ever before. And the spoken word for the first time has become as ubiquitous as the written word. And so as we see this, we're seeing many thinkers taking to the new media, as they call it, right? Many people are taking to the new media to get their ideas into the world. And I think that's very important because I think that is how we discover truth, is by bringing ideas into conversation with one another and then deciding between opposing viewpoints. Using our reason, using our critical thinking, using history, using all of these different things, we actually make decisions about what truth is. Which, of course, leads me to this next problem that I've heard. Well, then, if there's so much information out there, why isn't everybody smarter? It doesn't seem like it's universally made everybody smarter. And I think that the problem that's happening right now is that truth is more than just access to facts. If it was just access to facts, then Google would solve all of our problems. We would just know things. But we know instinctively that knowledge is more than that. And in fact, I would argue that truth has more to do with integrating ideas into your worldview than it does with memorizing facts and figures or being able to access them. So what's a worldview then? Well, a worldview is an interconnected web of ideas that are present in your mind that is the view through which, the lens through which you view the entire world. Obviously, that's where the title would come from, a world view. So basically, the easiest way I can think of to illustrate this is to talk about my son, Rowan, which, if you know me, you know I like to talk about Rowan. But imagine that Rowan, who's 3 years old, walks up to our coffee table and he sees a $100 bill and a Hot Wheels car, a brand new Hot Wheels car. Which one do you think he's going to pick? Well, it doesn't matter to him that he could buy 100 Hot Wheels cars with that $100, he's going to pick the thing that he knows has value. His worldview has not integrated the idea of money in a way that would allow him to make the proper value judgment in that scenario. Now, this is kind of a silly idea or a silly example, but I think it illustrates a lot of what people are struggling with today. Even if they see the truth in front of them, they see the two options clearly. There's nothing wrong with them perceiving that there are two options. The problem is that their values are informed by their worldview, and their worldview has not integrated the truth. So how do we fix this? Well, I think one of the ways we fix it is by listening to podcasts, by having conversations with people, by thinking deeply about these subjects. But ultimately, as a Christian, my answer is even clearer. My answer is that the truth is represented in a person, Jesus Christ. And so when we look at these things and we talk about these things, what we're really doing is we're participating in getting to know the truth from the perspective of a person of Jesus Christ. Now, that can be a little complicated, right? Because how do we find the theory of atomic theory? How do we find the idea that there are atoms that make up everything and there's even subatomic particles, all that? How does that reside in Jesus? Well, I don't mean that necessarily that resides in Jesus, although he is the force that holds all things together. I don't want to go down a theological rabbit trail, but that is true, right? But what I'm talking about is the fact that Jesus is the grounding and foundation of all truth. So whatever we're talking about, we can always point to Jesus to be our foundation. And so I wanted to bring up something that Jesus said that I think illustrates what we see in our culture today. He said, "Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will ever be hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them." It's kind of a tragic thing that Jesus is repeating. And if you take it seriously and you look at our culture, it breaks my heart to think that there are people out there who could see the reality of the world, and yet they are choosing. There's a hardness of heart that is forcing them to ever see, but never to understand. And so I hope through this podcast, not only that we would fix all those dumb people who don't get it, but that I myself would learn and grow as we talk about these ideas, and that the blind spots in my eyes and the deaf spots in my ears would be rectified by talking about ideas and the truth, by hearing from people who maybe hear this podcast and respond, or by continuing to put these ideas into the world and thinking as I speak through these things, that I would begin to see and hear more, knowing that, of course, all of this comes by the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. And for this introduction video, I want to actually lay out a couple of things as a foundation for us as we move forward on these videos. I'm not going to really be talking too much about, oh yeah, theologically, we have to build our foundations. I really am interested in these ideas out in the world and how they're impacting our life. And so I want to talk about, let's say for our first series, I want to talk about the 12 Rules for Life that Jordan Peterson wrote, his first book. And I want to run through each rule, and I want to talk about how those things can integrate into a biblical worldview and illustrate some concepts that are eminently biblical and that can transform our lives for the better. And that maybe Jordan Peterson has an idea in there. He has a conception in his 12 rules that can enrich and fulfill our lives as we move forward, even though he's not necessarily talking from an explicitly Christian perspective. I guess I'll make that comment now. You do not have to be a Christian to know truth. Now, I think that the fullness of truth is found in the person of Jesus Christ. So maybe everybody's knowledge outside of Christianity is incomplete, but that doesn't mean that any of their particular ideas are deficient, unless they contradict, of course, the truth. Now, we've been talking about truth since the beginning of this podcast, and yet I have not really talked about some of the presuppositions that lie underneath that word. And so I want to jump in there now, and I'll mention that I can dedicate an episode to any of these things. So if any of you are listening and you're like, man, I need to know more about that, please comment. We're going to be on YouTube. We're going to be on my website. I'll talk about that later. But there are a few presuppositions that we have to get out of the way so that we can just move forward as we talk through these ideas. Number one, objective truth exists. Okay, now, maybe you're thinking, what the heck is objective truth? Maybe you're thinking, I've heard this 1,000 times, or maybe you disagree vehemently with this concept. But this is one of the presuppositions we're going to start with. And all that it means is that truth is actually out there. It exists in reality, and we can either know it or we can be wrong, right? That if I were to claim, of course, in this moment, that I am wearing a red jacket. Now, I promise I'm not doing some fancy color stuff with the video and this is actually red. Let's just get that out of the way. If I claim I'm wearing a red jacket, I'm actually not wearing a red jacket. I'm sure somebody can go in there and talk about the physics of light and bending and like, do colors really exist or whatever. Whatever you want to say. My point is that there's a statement I'm making. This is a red jacket. It is false. It does not line up with the objective truth. And so it's different, of course, than the classic idea that has been bandied about recently that's my truth versus your truth. We can all have our own versions of truth. Now, maybe we don't want to go down this rabbit hole too long, like I'm saying, but maybe you're considering the idea of religious truth as fitting into this category of subjective feeling or subjective knowing or my truth. I will tell you, Neil deGrasse Tyson had this really interesting quote from the Joe Rogan podcast where he basically said that. He said, religious belief belongs in a different category than scientific truth. That's utterly absurd. And I can address that very quickly in the sense that if religion and religious belief is to have any real effect, then it must be true. I can't just pretend that there's a God out there or that there's a Jesus out there and that's just my truth. It's either true or it is not true. And there are people who are going to disagree with that. There are atheists who are going to say that God doesn't exist at all. There are Muslims who wouldn't believe that Jesus is God. There's a whole slew of contradicting opinions. And at the bottom of it is this idea that there is actually something right. You may not know what it is, but there is something true and something false. So that's one of the underlying presuppositions. So when I make these claims, I'm actually making these claims as if they are true, regardless of what we think or feel about them. Second, I'll be talking from the idea or from the perspective that God exists, that he created the universe and revealed himself through the Bible and ultimately in the person of Jesus. Now, maybe you're thinking, why are you making that assumption? That seems like a big leap. Well, first of all, I think that it's only through the lens of biblical Christianity, only through the knowledge of Jesus Christ that we get the fullest picture of the world as it really is. And of course, in these episodes, we'll build on those ideas. We'll build on these concepts, and you'll start to see as you build out your worldview, oh, there's something actually missing if we don't integrate the idea of God and specifically Jesus Christ. And then secondly, of course, it's just who I am. I can't talk about these ideas without them being connected. I talked about the worldview being kind of a web of interconnected ideas. And if you pull on my Jesus thread, it's running throughout everything that I know. Of course, we will start to see those relationships develop as we talk about truth. And a lot of things you'll see will come back to my biblical understanding of how the world works. It happens to line up with psychological studies. It happens to line up with scientific realities. And that's because underneath everything is the idea of God as creator, of Jesus as Lord. And so as we talk about these things, of course, especially as we get into narratives and mythology and some of the other stuff that I'd love to talk about, you'll start to see that really what I'm talking about when I talk about the biblical worldview is something that does not take away from every other manner of knowing truth and finding truth. It undergirds our entire conception of what the world is and how it operates. And so we get to the last of these presuppositions. And this one I've already mentioned. Truth requires conversation. There's this term, the marketplace of ideas. And the very reason I'm doing this podcast is to try and enter into that marketplace, bring my ideas forward, and then let them interact and compete. It's kind of a capitalistic metaphor, right? We want these things to compete, and may the best understanding of reality prevail. This has happened since the beginning of time, where philosophers and theologians have come together and conversed and decided, you know what, this truth, this idea just doesn't hold water. It doesn't stand up. There was an idea once upon a time that if you let meat rot, that actually maggots would spontaneously generate from the rotting flesh. Sorry, it's kind of a graphic example. But one scientist came along and he isolated the rotting meat in a jar. And he had a control where there was a rotting meat that wasn't in a jar, or, he had several different ways, and he set this up scientifically. But the whole point is, when you seal a jar and you don't allow flies to come and implant the eggs that turn into maggots, that rotting meat does not spontaneously generate life in the form of maggots. Once again, I picked a rather gruesome example, but the idea here, or grotesque, let's say, the idea here is that through that experimentation, he was able to show that actually this idea is not as valuable for knowing truth as the idea that, no, what's happening with that rotting meat is it's attracting flies who are laying eggs that are turning into maggots, right? And so as we talk about these things, I am certain that some of my ideas will, when put to the test, either logically, scientifically, or otherwise, will fall down. And one of the ways that we want to buttress our worldview so that that doesn't happen is we want to test our ideas across multiple layers. So if I believe that God is ultimately love and defined as a self-sacrificial love, we can talk more about that, then I should believe that to be like God is to love people well. And as I look out into the world, I should be able to see that scientifically. I should see that psychologically. I should see that philosophically. And while it seems like an abstract concept, I do think that the evidence from all the various fields lend itself to the idea that the organizing principle of the entire universe is a God who is love. And so as we talk about these things, I hope that when we discuss these ideas, that there's pushback, that there's feedback, that there's various ways where I can grow and learn and test. It's almost like we're walking conceptually out on this web of worldview ideas. And as we encounter the world, certain threads have to fall away and we have to rebuild certain sections as we continue to integrate. But hopefully by doing that, we clear our eyes of the misconceptions and the biases and the prejudices that might keep us from seeing the world as it really is. It's extremely important to see the world as it really is. And in the midst of this information revolution, we can interact with ideas so much more easily than ever before. And we can learn and grow farther than maybe we could have imagined 30 years ago. Now, it is no coincidence that in the middle of this information revolution, in the middle of a world that needs truth, that requires conversation, free speech is being attacked, and even the idea of objective truth is being attacked from so many angles, whether it's cancel culture, censorship, whether it's the idea that of relative truth that's gained a lot of popularity, the idea that it's either my truth, your truth. Don't tell me what you believe because it might offend me and it might be different than my beliefs. We need to get rid of all of that. We need to talk through some of that, and we need to figure out what it means to search for and discover truth today. Because trust me when I say, the amount of information that comes at us does not make us more well-informed, as I said before, but instead it's an integrated worldview that's going to allow us to see the world as it really is, sift through the baloney that's out there, sift through the chaff and find the nuggets of gold, the truth that lies in the world for us to discover and act upon. And if we start doing this and we go on this journey and we're humble enough to accept that we might be wrong, then hopefully as we talk through these ideas, we can find concepts and facts to integrate into a worldview that causes us to be more prosperous, that causes us to be more fulfilled, that causes us to act in a way that is consistent with reality. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Those are some of my ideas, some of the presuppositions that are going to be running throughout this entire show. Our next episode is going to be launching into Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And as we begin this, I know there's going to be mistakes that I'm going to make. There's going to be technical things that we're fixing. There's going to be a whole bunch of stuff, but I'm excited to be on this journey, and I'm hoping to continue to publish these videos. My goal is once a month, so that's where we'll be going and heading. Thank you so much for watching and listening. You can catch these on The Unfamiliar Name at any podcast location. You can also catch it on YouTube, and you can follow me at my website, theunfamiliarname.com. Also, reach out if you want to talk about anything. I have an email, theunfamiliarnamepodcast@gmail.com. I'll have a contact form on the website. And while it was kind of a interesting dive where we kind of talked about some of these concepts that are super important, but we just kind of skimmed the surface, I hope that I didn't ramble too much. I hope that it was intelligible, and I hope that we'll build on this. And like I said, the goal of this is to have an integrated worldview that knows the truth, because ultimately, as Jesus taught us, the truth will set you free. Great talking to you, and I hope to see you again.